You are standing on the edge of the world, and the water is rising. It swallows the fields, it climbs the hills, it reaches the place where you thought you were safe. And when it is done, nothing you built remains, not your home, not your tools, not the story of who you were. This is not a nightmare. This is a memory shared by nearly every civilization that has ever existed on this planet. From Mesopotamia to China, from Greece to the Americas, from India to Australia, story after story, culture after culture. Humanity remembers a flood, a great one, a world-ending one. The details shift, the names change, the gods multiply or disappear, the boats vary in size and shape, but the core never changes. The water rises, the world dies, one person survives. And the world begins again. The question is not whether these stories are literally true in every detail. The question is far more unsettling. Why did so many people who never met each other, who lived on different continents, separated by oceans and millennia, all remember the same catastrophe? The mathematics alone should stop you cold. The Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE, contains a flood narrative in its 11th tablet. A man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god E that a great flood will destroy humanity. He builds a boat. He loads his family and the animals inside. He seals the door with pitch. The rain falls for 6 days and 7 nights. The world is submerged. When the waters recede, Utnapishtim sends out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven does not return. Dry land has been found. Sound familiar? It should. The book of Genesis, written roughly 1,000 years later, tells nearly the same story with different names. Noah instead of Utnapishtim. One God instead of many, 40 days of rain instead of 7, but the structure is almost identical. The boat, the animals, the birds, the covenant at the end. This is not coincidence, it is inheritance. In the 1920s, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, the same Ur where Abraham, according to the Bible, was said to have been born. Beneath the royal cemetery, beneath layer after layer of civilization, Woolley's team hit something unexpected. A thick deposit of clean, sterile clay. No pottery, no tools, no bones, just mud, nearly 3 meters deep. Woolley's wife, Catherine, who was standing at the edge of the excavation pit, looked down and asked the question that made headlines around the world. Is this the flood? Woolley believed it was. He published his findings, and the Western world was electrified. Physical proof of the Great Flood. Evidence that scripture was history. But the story was more complicated than the headlines suggested. Subsequent excavations at other Mesopotamian cities revealed similar flood layers. At Shurapak, at Kish, at other sites across the alluvial plain of southern Iraq. But here is the crucial detail. These flood deposits did not all date to the same time. At Ur, the layer corresponded to roughly 2900 BCE. At Shurapak, about 2700 BCE. At Kish, closer to 2600 BCE. What Woolley had found was not evidence of one global flood. He had found evidence of many catastrophic local floods, happening repeatedly over centuries, in a land where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers regularly drowned entire cities. Each flood was devastating to the people who experienced it. Each generation passed down the memory, and over centuries the stories merged. Multiple floods became one flood. A regional disaster became a world-ending myth. This is how mythology works, not through pure invention, through amplification. But Mesopotamia is only the beginning. Expand your view across the entire globe. In Hindu mythology, the Satapatha Brahmana and the Matsya Purana describe a great flood. The god Vishnu appears to the sage Manu in the form of a small fish. The fish grows larger and larger. It warns Manu that a flood is coming and tells him to build a boat. Manu obeys. The flood comes. The fish, now enormous, pulls the boat through the waters to safety on the peak of a mountain. The world begins again through Manu's devotion. This story dates back at least 3,000 years. In Greek mythology, Zeus sends a catastrophic flood to destroy the wicked Bronze Age humanity. Only Deucalion, son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha survive. They float in a wooden chest, a small box, really, for 9 days and 9 nights. They land on Mount Parnassus. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which transform into human beings. The story is told in Ovid's Metamorphoses and in Apollodorus's library, but its roots may be far older than either text. In Chinese mythology, the sage Emperor Gun spends 9 years trying to control a world-consuming flood by building dikes and dams. He fails. His son, Yu the Great, succeeds by dredging channels and directing the waters into rivers and eventually to the sea. Yu becomes the founder of the Xia dynasty, the first dynasty in Chinese tradition. The flood is not just a disaster here. It is the event that creates Chinese civilization itself. Among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, multiple groups carry oral traditions describing a time when the sea rose and swallowed the land. These are not vague impressions. They contain specific geographic details, the names of places now underwater, descriptions of landscapes that geologists have confirmed were above sea level thousands of years ago. The linguist and geographer Patrick Nunn, working at the University of the Sunshine Coast, has argued that some of these Aboriginal flood memories may preserve events that occurred over 7,000 years ago. 7,000 years. That is roughly 300 generations of spoken transmission. And the stories still contain accurate information about real coastlines. How is that even possible? The Muisca people of the Colombian highlands tell of a flood sent by the god Chibchacum as punishment for humanity's sins. The Maya Popol Vuh describes the gods destroying their second creation, the wooden people, with a great flood and a rain of resin. In Mesopotamia, the even older Atrahasis epic, dating to around 1800 BCE, gives a more detailed and more disturbing version of the catastrophe. The gods send the flood because humanity has become too loud, too numerous, too chaotic. The social order between divine and mortal has broken down. The flood restores balance. It is a cosmic reset. Nearly 300 distinct flood myths have been catalogued by scholars worldwide. Every inhabited continent, every major language family. Why? What explains this universal memory? 2 forces. One geological, one psychological. The geological answer begins with the end of the last ice age. Between roughly 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, the great ice sheets that covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia began to melt. Sea levels rose, not gradually, in violent surges. Meltwater Pulse 1A, a rapid rise of approximately 13 to 20 meters in global sea level that occurred around 14,000 years ago, was one of the most dramatic flooding events in Earth's recent history. Entire coastlines were swallowed. Land bridges were severed. The plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe was flooded. In the North Sea, a vast inhabited landscape called Doggerland, where Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived, hunted, and buried their dead, was slowly and then suddenly consumed by the rising ocean. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami around 6200 BCE that may have delivered the final blow. The people who lived there had to flee. They carried their stories with them. And then there is the Black Sea. In 1997, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pitman of Columbia University published a provocative hypothesis. They proposed that around 5600 BCE, the rising Mediterranean Sea broke through the narrow Bosporus Strait and poured into what was then a smaller, freshwater Black Sea. The water may have risen at a rate of nearly a foot per day. Villages along the shoreline were drowned. Farmland was destroyed. Tens of thousands of people may have been displaced in a matter of months. Ryan and Pitman argued in their book Noah's Flood that survivors carried this catastrophe southward into Mesopotamia, where it was absorbed into the oral tradition that eventually became the Epic of Gilgamesh's flood story, and much later, the biblical account of Noah. The hypothesis remains debated. Geologist Valentina Yanko-Hambach and her team have argued that the Black Sea flooding was more gradual than Ryan and Pitman proposed, and that evidence for a sudden, catastrophic inundation remains inconclusive. But even the critics acknowledge a fundamental truth. At the end of the last ice age, the world's coastlines were redrawn by water. Entire landscapes vanished, and the people who lived through those transformations experienced them as the end of their world. The psychological answer is more intimate. Floods are the most common natural disaster on Earth. Every river valley civilization was shaped by them. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River. Floods destroyed harvests, killed livestock, flattened homes, and drowned families, and they came without warning. One day your life is intact. The next day the water is at your door. This kind of sudden, total loss is exactly the experience that burns itself into collective memory. When ancient people needed a metaphor for absolute destruction, for the complete erasure of everything they knew, they reached for the flood. Not because one flood happened, because every flood felt like the end of the world. And here is the twist most people miss. These myths are not primarily about water. They are about morality. In almost every flood story across every culture, the flood is sent for a reason. The gods are angry. Humanity has become wicked, violent, corrupt, disobedient. The flood is a punishment, and the survivor Utnapishtim Noah Manu Deucalion is saved because he is righteous, because he listened, because he obeyed, because he was the last good person in a world that had gone wrong. The flood myth is not a weather report. It is a moral framework. It tells you that the universe cares about how you behave, that there are consequences for cruelty and arrogance and breaking the sacred order, and that even in total annihilation, virtue survives. The good are spared. The world can be rebuilt. This is why the myth persists across thousands of years and thousands of miles. Not because it records one historical event with perfect fidelity, but because it encodes a psychological truth that every human being recognizes. Bad behavior has consequences. Catastrophe can arrive without warning. And the people who listen, who prepare, who remain faithful to something larger than themselves, they survive. Modern researchers have given this phenomenon a name. Flood memory refers to the way communities preserve knowledge of past disasters through oral tradition, ritual, and story. Patrick Nunn's work on Aboriginal Australian narratives demonstrates that this memory can be astonishingly accurate over millennia, preserving specific details about coastlines and sea level changes that only make sense when correlated with geological data collected using modern technology. That is not myth. That is memory. Accurate, detailed, and transmitted across 300 generations through nothing but the spoken word. So the next time you hear a flood myth, whether it comes from a temple wall in Mesopotamia, a scroll in India, a codex in Mexico, or an elder's voice in Australia, do not dismiss it as a fairy tale. The water was real. The terror was real. The displacement of entire peoples was real. What the myth adds is not exaggeration, it is meaning. It takes a geological event and transforms it into a moral lesson. It takes a local catastrophe and scales it to the entire world. It takes the voice of one survivor and makes it the voice of all humanity. You are standing on the edge of the world and the water is rising. But this time you know the story, you know where it comes from, you know why it was told. And you know that what comes after the flood is not just destruction. It is the chance, the oldest chance there is to begin again.